To another episode of Thoughts of a Techno Wizard. I'm sorry, goodness, every time. Becoming a Techno Wizard. Thoughts is the audio journal podcast. Probably the same thing, whatever. But we're going to jump right into it. Got a lot to cover. I want to try and do this, keep it generally short, and then jump on over to an anarchy video I have not done in like weeks. So let's see if we can get all that done. So to recap last time, um, section 79 through 80, part 35 of the Introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel continues to how consciousness develops through stages throughout history, through a process of realizing how what was thought to be real consciousness was actually unreal. That is, we learned that what we thought true before was actually not. We continue this process until we get to a point of completion in consciousness, where we can see all that came before to better understand our current consciousness. But will we ever get there? Is there an end at all? With the help of Dr. Sattler, we can see how we have two options when we develop our consciousness from real to unreal. Either create a definite nothingness or a negation of what we know in order to learn more, or park ourselves in this cul-de-sac of skepticism, that is nihilism, where nothing matters. Hegel shows that consciousness can put it up its own limits, then move beyond those limits in order to become more complete. But in the process of surpassing those limits, we may stop due to unthinking inertia, where we refuse to think about the problem we find. Due to goodness, that's one thinking inertia, or due to sentimentality, where we think our current position is okay despite it not being, or due to the vanity of skepticism, where we insist that we can never know anything, or thus dismiss all attempts at learning more. So that's kind of my recap of the last section. Gonna go over Dr. Sattler's and then we'll get into it. So Sattler says Hegel starts by discussing the dialectical development of the forms of consciousness and human history. The natural consciousness at each stage regards the process as a negative one, and skepticism remains a perennial but sterile possibility. What occurs, however, at each stage is a determinate negation. He also outlines what the end state will be like. Object will correspond to notion and notion to object. I didn't really put much about that part until the process is completed. However, there will be a non coincidence between object and notion, consciousness and knowledge. This is because consciousness itself involves a breaching of limits, even limits which it imposes upon itself. Hegel also considers several unproductive responses to this ongoing negativity: stubbornness, sentimentality, and skepticism, and why they also reveal their own limitations. So I think we're pretty much, on par with each other there. All right, now time to get started. Here we go. I don't know what speed is on.
In addition to these preliminary general remarks about the manner and the necessity
Oh,
of the progression, it may be useful to say something about the method of carrying out the inquiry. If this exposition is viewed as a way of relating science to phenomenal knowledge and as an investigation and examination of the reality of cognition, it would seem that it cannot take place without some presupposition which can serve as its underlying criterion. For an examination consists in applying an accepted standard and in determining whether something is right or wrong on the basis of the resulting agreement or disagreement of the thing examined. Thus, the standard as such, and science likewise, if it were the criterion, is accepted as the essence or as the in itself. But here, where science has just come on the scene, neither science nor anything else has yet justified itself as the essence or the in itself. And without something of the sort, it seems that no examination can take place.
so this is almost going back to the very beginning, right? Where he says science has to prove itself, right? You can't just say, "Oh, yeah, I'm doing science." There we go. No, you have to show that you are, worthy of getting of answering these questions that you say you're going to answer, right? By doing that process and things like that.
In section 81, Hegel is continuing his reflections on just what the method needs to be for carrying out the kind of inquiry that he has in mind, namely a phenomenological inquiry. And we've already looked at quite a bit what that encompasses. There's a bit more about that later in the introduction. That's going to be very important and interesting. This is sort of a juncture where he's introducing a new wrinkle, a new problematic into it, this question of the criterion and where we're going to get that from. This is really, to go back to the very beginning of the preface, the issue of presuppositions. How do you begin without presuppositions when the whole goal is to figure out whether the presuppositions that we've had in place before are actually justified, and then to transform them into something more systematically articulated, something that can justify itself. When we talk about a presupposition or an axiom, the way the Greeks talked about it, what we mean is something that we're taking for granted. So that's something you want to keep in mind as we go through this. So he talks about the fact that an inquiry, an investigation, the sort of thing that we're engaged in throughout the rest of the phenomenology, requires some sort of presupposition. And we don't need to think just in terms of big philosophical texts, like this, or Being in Time, or Meditations on, first philosophy, or anything along those sorts of lines. We can think of the everyday investigations that we carry out. Is it warm when I get up? Well, I can answer that very quickly. Put my hand outside of the covers. No, it's cold. And then, there could be further conclusions. Stay in bed. Nope, get up. Got to go to work. Get over there and turn the heater on and warm it up here. We could think of cooking and culinary arts. Is a dish made well? There's a number of different criteria that we can go by. We can look at the plating. How does it actually look on the plate? Does it look the way that it's supposed to, going by our previous experience and the traditions of culinary arts? How does it taste? Do the tastes mingle together properly? Is it overpowered by one? And we could keep on going on and on and on. The point is, any sort of inquiry that we're involved in involves us in some sort of presuppositions, not just presuppositions about what exists or things like that. There's all sorts of presuppositions that we're constantly using, but a presupposition that functions as a criterion that allows us to say yes or no, or this much, or doesn't pass, or needs improvement, all those sorts of things. So that raises some real issues. Why? Well, this inquiry, Hegel's trying to remind us of what we're actually up to here. It's about relating science, Wissenschaft, science in this global, expansive, self-aware sense, not just as what we find in textbooks or what we call the natural sciences or even the social sciences today, but something that would be truly philosophical, relating science to phenomenal knowledge. Now, what does that mean, phenomenal knowledge? That means knowledge about the experiential world that we run across. And you might say, well, that's exactly what science as we currently understand it does. And you're right. Except that it doesn't encompass all of the phenomena. It doesn't encompass everything that we do experience that can be perceived. In part because science today focuses so much on, study design and replicability and all, and that's fine. That's great. Not knocking that. As a matter of fact, there's a very important reason for that in physics or in chemistry or in psychology. But that's not the criteria for what we should take into our purview when it comes to philosophy. Thinking more broadly, more encompassing, trying to extend ourselves to all of being. Anything that can appear for us can be an object of knowledge for Hegel, and does become, at least in theory, an object of knowledge in the phenomenology. Another thing we're engaged in is an examination, or as he calls it, in German, a Prüfung, a putting to the test of the reality of cognition, of Erkennen, Erkenntnis, sorry, the reality, whether what we think to be knowledge truly is so. Now, this is not a new project. You might think of Descartes' Meditations in that respect, or Sextus Empiricus' discussions of skeptical arguments and tropes and things like that. We do want to figure out what counts as the criterion for us for real knowledge. Do we actually have knowledge of reality, or do we just have knowledge that's something floating around in our head or perhaps in our linguistic system? Does our knowledge actually extend to real things? It's a real question. Real question, kind of a joke there. So that's what's going on here. Now, Hegel wants to remind us, and he's going to explore this a little bit more in detail in the next sections, that when we're talking about having an examination, we have some sort of standard, some sort of criterion, something that we're using as our measure. And the German word here actually, Maßstab, measure. And we use that standard to look at the thing that's being examined. So again, let's use culinary arts as an example. There are certain standards for what constitutes a good biscotti, right? And perhaps those standards could be modified. We'll get to that in just a moment. But there are certain standards that if you were to go and take a cooking class at a fine culinary institute, they would actually be able to hand you something and say, look, here's the bullet points, here's the rubric, here's what counts as a good biscotti. By the way, here, try this one so you have some experiential knowledge of that. And thereby you have the standard. And then there's the thing examined. So you take your biscotti out of the oven. Not so good. You twice bake them a little bit too long and they're kind of burnt. Or you didn't first bake them long enough. Biscotti have to be baked twice, right? Or what makes them biscotti. And so when you cut, you didn't get a good cut on it and it doesn't look that attractive. It tastes fine, but doesn't look that good. We're looking at the thing examined and we're saying this standard applies to it. And the term that Hegel actually used here could be, if we want to be very literal, it could be rendered as equality or inequality, Gleichheit, or Ungleichheit. But it's better perhaps to translate it this way as corresponds. Either the thing that's being examined does correspond to the standard that we're imposing upon it, or it doesn't correspond. And perhaps this could be a matter of degrees. So, in grading papers, I often give my students, well, actually always give my students rubrics, and it tells them, here's what an A paper should be like, here's what a B paper should be like, here's what a C paper should be like. There are certain grades established. And you could say, well, there's really only two grades that matter, F or not F. Right? Well, a D is very different than an A. An A is, that's the standard for correspondence. Now, it's kind of interesting to bring that up, though. What counts as an A paper? In some of my classes,
defines that,
where things might be a bit more routine and easy, it's fairly easy to specify what an A paper should do, what it should encompass. Sometimes we have to use qualitative terms that people may not fully understand, but they can, get their head around it, especially if you provide them with models. And so we say, here's the bar. If you go this place, you get a B. If you want to get an A, you got to go this high. What about the student who goes this high? Well, they will get an A+. Well, a lot of places don't have an A+ when you're grading. And I don't know why that's the case. We used to have them when I was in college. But in many cases, if we want to give a person an A, what we're expecting them to do is to go above and beyond what the established measures and standards are. We want them to do something not necessarily radically new, to reinvent some philosophical concept that's been lost for 3,000 years or 2,000 years or 1,000 years. That's a little bit too much to expect.
That's one for the thesis. No,
to do something novel, to generate a new configuration on the object that's being discussed. Now, what's happening there? This goes right to the heart of what Hegel is closing this with. Sometimes the thing that we're examining
comes the standard,
might call
or
into
is the
question
standard.
the adequacy
of
the standard. This is the case for both, good productions, A-level work in philosophical papers, and for things that are, in fact, radically new. Sui generis, as we say, of their own genre, not able to be measured well by the standards. So he says here, an examination consists in applying an accepted standard and in determining whether something is right or wrong on the basis of that. Now, here, where science has just begun to come on the scene, neither science nor anything else has yet justified itself as the essence or the in itself. Why is he bringing up these terms? Essence, Wesenheit, or in itself, an sich? Because the standard is something that is taken as being essential, as having being in itself independent of whatever else that we're looking at, independent of the examiner, independent of the thing examined. The standard pre-exists. But here we're dealing with a science that is in the process of being developed. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we have some standards beforehand that then we can apply to Hegelian science, Hegelian Wissenschaft, and say, well, it just doesn't measure up, or it does measure up, or something like that? We've just spent the whole preface exploring why that's not the case, why the previous forms of doing philosophy, while they may in fact have something to contribute, like Aristotle's does, to understanding what's going on, they're not adequate for fully developed Hegelian science, and they're not adequate for seeing how it should develop along the way. Could science itself be the standard that we're looking for? Well, how can it do that if it's not fully developed? So what we're doing, somebody, if they want to be joking about this, they could say, well, see, Hegel was just sort of making it up as he goes along. There is a certain truth to that. Some of this is, in fact, being developed as it goes along. Now, when we say making it up as one goes along, there's a certain sort of arbitrariness there, a lack of necessity. a Willkürlichkeit in German, something that depends on my own choice, my own will. That would be the examiner sort of just coming up with standards that then will fit whatever it is that he or she wants to find over there. That's not going to work. So we have to see what would go beyond that. Hegel's leaving us here with a puzzle.
Let's see what he's doing in this puzzle. Oh, sorry.
Definite if we call to mind the abstract determinations of truth.
Sorry. Let me back up a little bit. I don't know what happened there.
Hegel's leaving us here with a puzzle.
If I could take a quick stab real quick. I think what he's going to say in order to solve this puzzle, right, is like as we develop things, we kind of set a standard and then move past it, right? Similar to what he's saying with the stages. It's like, okay, what if this is true, right? And then you can, do science, right? Verify or test against it and see if your own tests, verify that it's true or disprove it, right? So in that way you can constantly build better standards and test against them in order to build better standards. So yeah, I think that's probably where he's going to be going with this. I don't know, we'll see.
This contradiction and its removal will become more definite if we call to mind the abstract determinations of truth and knowledge as they occur in consciousness. Consciousness, abstract determination. This contradiction and its removal will become more definite if we call to mind the abstract determinations of truth and knowledge as they occur in consciousness. Consciousness simultaneously distinguishes itself from something and at the same time relates itself to it, or as it is said, this something exists for consciousness. And the determinate aspect of this relating, or the being of something for a consciousness, is knowing. But we distinguish this being for another from being in itself. Whatever is related to knowledge or knowing is also distinguished from it and posited as existing outside this relationship. This being in itself is called truth. Just what might be involved in these determinations is of no further concern to us here. Since our object is phenomenal knowledge, its determinations too will at first be taken directly as they present themselves. And they do present themselves very much as we've already apprehended them.
So I think that's somewhat getting into it, but from a, different, I don't want to say perspective or so, but like the idea of, I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm even understanding that right. Before he gets into it, let me just see. Its removal will become the definite if we call to mind the abstract determinations of truth and knowledge as they occur in consciousness. Yeah, I think it's more or less right. It's like you come up with the idea of like what's in that abstract, right? What's the ideal situation? What do you think is going to happen, right? Then you test it, and in doing so, it becomes definite. It becomes something that is real, is defined, and then through testing it, then you can see if it is abstract, if it is defined. Conscious simultaneously distinguishes itself from something and at the same time relates itself to it, or as it is said, that something exists for consciousness, right? So as we think about things, we become aware of them, we become able to think about them, able to hold them in our minds as a real thing. And the determined aspect of this relating or the being of something for consciousness is knowing. Yeah. So as we relate to that thing, as we gain an understanding of what this thing is that we're thinking about, it becomes real for us, and it becomes a part of our brain, right? Our knowledge base and our understanding of the world, and then we can dismiss that or build upon it, and so on and so forth. And distinguishes being for another from being in itself. That part I'm not 100% sure of. Whatever is related to knowledge or knowing is also distinguished from and posited as existing outside of this relationship. This being in itself is called. Okay, yeah. So it's like we have this abstract idea of what the truth is, and by trying to relate to it, we are necessarily seeing ourselves as different from it, right? And so we're seeing that whatever it is the truth, and we're trying to get closer to it, right? So like as we think about something, it requires us to try and relate to it, to try and grasp to it, right? To try and understand what it is. But by doing so, right, the very act of doing so is in and of itself a separation of it and us. Right. So it shows that we are kind of outside of this thing that we're observing, and what we're observing is what we think to be the truth, and we're trying to get closer to it by relating and stuff like that. At least that's more or less what I think he's saying here. Just what might be involved in this determination of no further concern to us here, since the object is phenomenology, is its determinations to at first two will at first be taken directly as the present themselves, and they do present themselves very much as we have already printed them. Yeah. So as we understand them, they become real. They become something that we really believe in.
Paragraph 82.
Let's see.
Paragraph 82 begins a movement which is going to be carried out through the following paragraphs all the way to the very end of the introduction. And it's going to be this interplay between the for itself and the in itself, for consciousness. We want to see how this actually develops. Now, Hegel is positing this as the way out of the contradiction, the Widerspruch, the problematic that we found ourselves in just in the last paragraph, where science could be accused of sort of making it up as it goes along, because it has to develop its own criteria in the very process of becoming science, of phenomenal reality, and figuring out its own relation to phenomenal knowledge in the process. So what we're going to look at here is just the beginning point of this. Some of this movement is quite familiar. We begin with consciousness itself, and we know from the preface that consciousness distinguishes itself from an other, from its object that it's studying, that it's engaged with, and at the same time it also relates itself to the other. This is part of the process of self-movement and self-othering that we saw goes on within any sort of important or active reality, and which also goes on for the knowing subject. And this develops for us the act of knowing, of coming to learn, of wrapping our minds around something. This relating itself to the other, for human beings, means coming to know it. Mm-hmm. Now, what that means is that the other, as it is for us in this act of knowing, or this process of knowing, this inquiry, is for consciousness. It is not in itself, it's as it is for us. So I'm going to get away from cooking metaphors, and we'll just use things like mathematics, for example. If you actually go further into mathematics than they require you to in K through 12 education, or the little bit that we require in college, there's an awful lot going on there, and it's really brilliant and beautiful stuff. Quite elegant. Elegance is actually a mathematical criterion for whether a proof is a good proof. It's not just whether the proof works. Elegance, which is something harder to wrap your head around and to define, is indeed a desideratum. Now, when we're studying mathematics, we're trying to understand number and the relations between number. There's a body of objects out there that we're coming to terms with. And they're ideal objects, but they can also apply to things in the world. And at any given point, what is over here is for the consciousness that is understanding it, that is learning it, that is coming to use it and apply it. Insofar as that's what it is for consciousness. Right. Now, what can we distinguish against that? The in itself. Something that would be beyond, a surplus, let's say. The surplus over the for other, for consciousness. Something more. So he says we distinguish this being for another from being in itself. Whatever is related to knowledge or knowing is also distinguished from it. So now we have yet another thing. If we think about knowledge or knowing as being what's going on with consciousness, as being an outgrowth of it, now we have yet another relating going on. The for the in itself is related to the for consciousness, or the for other. And he says it's posited as existing outside of this relationship. Now, what does that mean? When he's saying posited, he means placed, put. Now, who's doing the putting? That's a good question. That's going to start leading us where we want to go. I'm not going to answer that quite yet, because that's going to get answered in the other sections. But I do want to stress that question. Who's doing the positing? Here we want to focus on what is positive. It's posited as outside. So the other, There's some aspect of it that exceeds what consciousness is able to make of it. We have the knowing person and we have the known object, and they stand over and against each other.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, what are we after here? Well, we have another name for this being in itself. We call this truth. We can speak of the truth of what is known. Knowledge is related to truth.
Mm-hmm.
Consciousness is about knowing what is true, relating itself to what is true. So he says, just what might be involved in these determinations is of no further concern to us here, since our object is phenomenal knowledge. Its determinations, too, will at first be taken directly as they present themselves. And they do present themselves very much as we have already apprehended them. So Hegel is saying it with that last sentence. We can go further into the metaphysics of this, but instead we're going to try to stick close to how things actually appear for us in the process. Let's see whether this truth, whether this in itself really does remain outside of and in a certain way opposed to consciousness.
I think I was on the dot with that.
Now, if we inquire into the truth of knowledge, it seems that we are asking what knowledge is in itself. Yet in this inquiry, knowledge is our object, something that exists for us. And the in itself that would supposedly result from it would rather be the being of knowledge for us. What we asserted to be its essence would not be so much its truth, but rather just our knowledge of it. The essence or criterion would lie within ourselves, and that which was to be compared with it and about which a decision would be reached through this comparison would not necessarily have to recognize the validity of such a standard.
Yeah.
So
that's what I was saying
to
before.
Be compared with it and about which a decision or criterion to be its knowledge is.
Yeah, we inquire into the knowledge of truth. So it's like we can have this idea that truth exists out there and stuff like that. But by trying to know it, by trying to understand it, we necessarily bring it into ourselves. Like we necessarily make it something that's for us, right? Make it something that's for us to try and understand. And so as we create this criteria, it has to be for us. Like there's no other, way, just by the act of knowing things, just the act of trying to perceive and understand the world, we necessarily create criteria, which is like our understanding of how we think the world works. Right. And so to, break past those limits, right. We, like I said, test those things. We verify them. We try to see if those criteria hold up. If they don't, then there's probably something wrong with our criteria, right? And so we know to then change it and that's how we can learn more about things, right? Just imagine if we don't change the criteria, like if we create some criteria and we say, oh, this is the ultimate idea of what the universe is, everything has to stand up to this, right? That means that whatever criteria that you created, even if you say, God put this down, right? You have no actual way to verify that is being called God, that is an all-powerful being, or you can't even verify that they are there. You can't verify that they're super powerful, they're all powerful. You can't even verify that they actually put this down. You just think they did, right? And so if you hold that as the criteria and try to stack everything against that, try to compare reality to your criteria and never change your criteria, then you're never going to get any closer to the reality of reality, right? To the truth. Because, the thing that you're holding, the thing that you're trying to test truth is in and of itself a limitation of your own consciousness, right? Of your own ability to understand things and to know things. It's only by moving our criteria, by changing our criteria based on, our new understanding of things and the new way that we relate to things, can we then, keep improving and get closer to this truth. At least that's how I understand it so far.
In this very short section, 83, we're getting really set up for a major shift that's going to take place in the subsequent sections. And it has to do with the in itself and the for itself and how we're going to make sense of them in terms of consciousness and knowledge. So where are we starting here? We're starting with what knowledge is, the way that we understand knowledge to be in itself. So we've got consciousness, right? Knowledge is a relation to its object, something that's other than itself. And what I've got here is, knowledge is sort of a relation between the two that sort of penetrates into both of them. Now notice that we could actually say that knowledge, penetrates all consciousness if we want to, because knowledge is consciousness action. But it can only penetrate so far into the object. There is an in itself to the object that is partially revealed to us in knowledge, but really what's being revealed to us is how the object is for us. And so the truth of the object lies beyond on this other side that's in some way not yet accessible or perhaps inaccessible to us. And there's an estrangement that's going on here. Hegel's not talking about that so much, but you do want to sort of bear that in mind. Also remember what always happens whenever there's a limit in Hegelian philosophy. Pretty soon that limit's going to be breached. Now, how is that going to happen here? Think about what we're doing in representing this. We're talking about how knowledge is in itself. So what we're doing is we're saying that knowledge itself is something like the object that knowledge is of. There's a truth of knowledge that is perhaps different or certainly not coinciding with the truth of the object that for consciousness. And what we're seeing here is that consciousness is actually then taking a position on knowledge. Consciousness not only investigates the things, it also investigates what it is using to do the investigation. We see ourselves back at the concerns about medium or instrument that we began with, don't we? And what we realize is that knowledge is also for consciousness as well. So he says, if we inquire into the truth of knowledge, it seems that we're inquiring into what knowledge is in itself. But in this inquiry, knowledge is our object, something that exists for us. And the in itself that would result from it would rather be the being of knowledge for us, for consciousness. What we asserted to be its essence would not be its truth. What is the truth? The truth is what is in itself, but rather our knowledge of it. This gets very recursive. We're having knowledge of knowledge. We have a relationship of for itself to the knowledge that is also for itself, for how it relates objects to consciousness. It might take a little bit to digest what I just said right there, but that's what's going on here. So he says, well, how do we determine what its essence is then? But think about this again.
Yeah. But yeah, this is why metacognition is so important, right? The idea of thinking about what you're thinking about. Because, by thinking about, your own thoughts and how you think about the world, you can then, like what he said, hold your thoughts, hold your perspective of the world as its own object, and then create criteria for, okay, is the way I view the world even accurate, right? People all the time, like, we just see the world and we think that the way we view the world is, the world is, accurate. But sometimes, and oftentimes really, we have to question if our own perspective of the world is a good way to even view the world, right? So it's not just questioning what we see, but questioning how we see, right? And so by doing so, we can improve how we see, because we might figure out, oh, actually, I'm looking at it like this, right? And I need to look at it like this, or I have a filter on and I can't actually see everything that I thought I was seeing, so I need to remove that filter or whatever, right? Like there could be so many different barriers or limitations or ways in which the tools that we're using to gain that knowledge, to gain an understanding of the world, are themselves limiting what we can understand of the world. And so, yeah, I really like this section as well, as I do all of them, right? Like every section is just beautiful. So, yeah, man, it's beautiful. Just amazing.
In an inquiry, we need some sort of criterion that provides us with the essence. And normally when we're talking about the adequacy of our knowledge, we're saying, does it measure up to the object that we're actually trying to study? Now, it seems difficult to figure that out if there really is this limit that we can't get across, if there's an inaccessible in itself. But if we focus just on knowledge itself, where is the criterion? Well, the criterion lies within consciousness. The criterion by which knowledge is being measured, by which it's being compared, determined in its adequacy. It says, the essence or criterion would lie in itself, within ourselves. That which was to be compared with it and about which a decision would be reached through this comparison would not necessarily have to recognize the validity of such a standard. So what we've got going on here is a criterion for knowledge, by which knowledge is being measured in its adequacy. And at the same time, it seems like we have another criterion over here on the side of the object, indifferent to the criterion within ourselves. And that's where Hegel leaves off in this section. There's a lot still yet to be resolved,
Definitely.
but that's happening in the further sections.
Awesome. Beautiful stuff as always, just amazing. Thank you for watching and listening with me today. Let me know what you thought, what you learned from this section, and be back next week. And if you want to listen to the Anarchy episode, I'll probably do one right after this. So stay tuned. But yeah, have a great